Good evening to all our members, and a very, very warm welcome to all our visitors. And a big thank you to Jan for agreeing to do this presentation for us. Sarah, our president, is away at present, so I'm been asked to remind people about, well, our members, about the excursion that is due on Saturday, the 19th of June at King's Cross, starting at 2 p.m. We'll meet at the station, and we go around from King's Cross to Elizabeth Bay, collecting images for our scavenger hunt. If you look at our schedule, you'll be able to find the list of subjects that have been set. And if not, maybe I'll put them up also in Facebook so everybody can write them down if they can't find them on on our schedule. I'm looking forward to the meeting. Thank you, Jan. First of all, hand it over to Deirdre. She's got a few things to say.
Yep, okay. Well, I'm Deirdre. I'm also an East Photography Club committee member. So welcome everybody to Young's presentation, which is being hosted by East Photography Club. So I'll speak a little bit about our club. So we're a friendly club. We're always looking for new members. We meet at 7:30 p.m. on the second and fourth Tuesday of the month. And on the second Tuesday, we have a presentation by someone like Young. And on the fourth Tuesday of the month, that's where members exhibit their work around a theme. Even though we're located in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, we currently hold Tuesday night meetings via Zoom. So we now have members zooming in from places like Queensland and the UK. But when we do go back to face-to-face, we'll be meeting at East Leagues Club. But we're hoping to sort of look at alternating face-to-face meetings with Zoom meetings as well, and hoping that with the face-to-face meeting that it can be a hybrid one with people being able to Zoom in as well. We also have monthly face-to-face photo excursions around Sydney, so that's on weekends and weekdays. And then we have a monthly snap and chat at Centennial Park, where we just sort of sit there and chat over a coffee. We might take a few photos, and this is held 2 p.m. on the last Friday of the month.
We're all looking forward to this presentation. No, that I think our Zoom meetings are absolutely great, but I think there's nothing like meeting face to face and being with your members and enjoying their company and sharing all our ideas and all the new things that we have learned. So looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Snap and chat is absolutely fabulous for that.
Yeah, it is. It's just so nice to sit around and get a coffee.
The same way with our excursions. They're so good.
Yeah.
We spot things and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
The excursions, what's happened in the past is that we'll all go to one area and then we share the photos, and people have photographed the same thing, but it's got a slightly different look to it. So it's quite incredible how one particular subject can look so different with different photographers.
Yeah, exactly. Just a sort of different perspectives.
Yeah.
Someone will take something really close up and others will take it from quite far away.
It's good though. The excursions are great, and so is anyway.
If you want to get involved in the club, this is our email address here, and this is our website there. So it's got a whole lot more information about our club, and we'll put this up at the end as well, and then it will be in the recording. So basically, it's now over to Young.
Lovely. Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Jan, and I'm going to talk to you guys about my journey as a photographer today. We actually have quite a bit to go through. I've put a bit of an agenda up here, and the way I structured is to actually tell you guys a bit more about my background, and then kind of go through a couple of photos and areas that I took pictures of in the early stages of my kind of photography gear, starting in kind of Sydney and then moving more towards regional New South Wales, outside of New South Wales, and then also overseas. And I'm also going to talk about one of my specialties, which is astrophotography. So a little bit about me. You may actually have heard that already. I'm from Germany. I moved over here 10 years ago, and I currently live in Sydney. For the last 10 years, I worked as a risk and compliance officer for an internet company called Groupon, and I've recently joined another internet company called, like I think a couple of weeks ago, so still fairly new. But as a passion project, I kind of got into photography in 2015 or 2013 when I bought my new camera, but we're going to get to that in a bit of a second. So in terms of how my journeys actually started, back in 2004, I got the chance to travel around the world after I finished my high school. And one of my dad's friends gave me an analog SLR camera, which these pictures are taken off. I had absolutely no idea what aperture, what ISO, what focal length, all of that means. I only had one lens and a polarizer, but I already knew back then, when we're still shooting on film, that once these cameras are affordable as a digital product and are good enough to actually look better than, or even at least the same than analog cameras, I'm going to get one. So these are kind of, I guess, my first exposure to, let's say, a little bit more professional photography, but a lot of things have changed, including my hairstyle and a few other things in my life. So we'll get to that in a minute. In terms of the way I started with digital photography, this is actually my first digital camera I bought back in 2007 when I came to Australia for the second time in my life as a student. And that camera had 8 megapixels, but was great because it actually got me into the world of long exposure photography. And one of the first pictures I took with that camera was this picture. That was back in Germany, but what really caught my eye here was that the camera could capture something that I couldn't see with my own eyes, which were those light trails from a passing bus that just went past me. And I knew immediately that that's definitely something I want to explore, and this is something I want to spend more time on. And then the second thing this camera could do is actually something my camera these days can't do. It actually can have a shutter speed of up to 60 seconds without switching to bulb mode. And that back then allowed me to take a picture of the stars, which looks like this. Obviously not very interesting, but if you remember back in 2007, things were a little bit different and not that easy. So for me to actually see white dots on this darker background in 2007, in the middle of the second largest town of Germany, was actually quite an exciting moment. And I knew that the long exposure as well as the dark sky photography is something I want to explore a little bit more. Then in 2013, I eventually made that step and got into the digital SLR cameras and bought this Canon 70D, which is to date still the only camera or the only main camera I use for all my photography. And we get into my gear a little bit later. And then once I had that, I pretty much watched a lot of YouTube videos to kind of educate myself of how aperture works, because at the beginning I had literally no idea why people are using f8 not f9, or what's the difference between f10 and all of that stuff, and I was a little bit lost. But then throughout the years, obviously knew and found out what that means, and that it not always matters if you use f8 or f9 and things like that. But yeah, YouTube was definitely a good start for me. But I wish I had a lot of other people like they can actually talk to me face to face and fast track that whole process. But then after a couple of years of watching and experimenting, pictures looked a lot better, which is kind of this one here, which I put in there because it's a bit of a combination of those light trails that you saw on the very first picture I took with my previous camera, and the stars in the sky all together. By the way, that was, I think, near a place called Batlow, towards the snowy mountains early morning just before sunrise. And then throughout the years, kind of the theme of long exposure photography continued. Don't worry, this is not the Helensburgh glowworm tunnel. I would not do this in a glowworm tunnel where I would kill a lot of glowworms. I'm not that bad of a person, but yeah, definitely if you do that kind of photography, that's basically steel wool spinning. You put some steel wools in a whisk, light it and swing it. Obviously protect yourself. I don't want anyone to get hurt doing this kind of activity. And then these days, my astro pictures look like more like this. This is the blast furnace in Lithgow. I'm not sure if anyone's been there before, but it's a panorama shot probably 3 years ago with the Milky Way aligned over the remains of that blast furnace. And if you actually look at the bottom left here of this picture, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, you can actually see my sleeping bag down there because it was rather cold. And while I was doing a star trail later on, I just kind of jumped into my sleeping bag to stay warm. Also got into lots of reflections and getting low. We'll talk about that later in a minute as well, and also how I edited that photo. But you can see that pictures have kind of improved in terms of the quality. And then I think in 2018, I bought a phone that was a little bit more capable than my previous phone to actually take pictures, and got into a bit of smartphone photography as well, because obviously don't want to always carry around my heavy camera or my tripod. And I kind of spend a lot more time on focusing on actually interesting compositions itself. Yes, the phones are obviously not as great as a proper camera, but with an interesting subject, good composition and good lighting, you can actually get very decent results even with the phone camera. And that's basically what I wanted to try with that as well. So in terms of my gear, as I said before, I'm shooting with the 70D, which is a crop sensor camera. And when I bought that camera, I decided to go for kind of a medium zoom lens covering the wide angle from 18 to 135 centimeters, mainly because I was a bit too lazy to change lenses all the time. Those who've bought a kit cameras or like kit lenses usually get the 18 to 55 lens and the 55 to 250, which is a bit of a longer zoom, but I thought I'll just be happier with one lens. And I think I still would go for the same decision rather than having to swap lenses and missing at certain moments because I didn't have the right gear. This is the tripod I currently use. This is not my first tripod. I don't really want to be a brand ambassador, but it seems to work for me. It has those kind of rubber grips, so not any clips, which almost hurt my fingers, and kind of these twisty things, which seem to work quite well. Yeah, quite happy with that, but can't really tell you if that's better or worse than any of the other brands that are currently out there. And I only use 2 filters at the moment. They're both screw-on filters. One is the ND filter, 10 stops, mainly to get those kind of smooth clouds, long exposure kind of effect. And the other one is a polarizing filter to take out the glare, to make maybe sometimes the greens a bit greener and the blue sky a bit bluer, shooting with those kind of filters. These are the only ones I have. And I've thought about going into kind of those Nisi filters that, I don't know, a lot of the friends I know use, but kind of never really got around to it and feel like I can create similar effects either later in post-production or with these kind of filters. And then for a lot of behind the scenes content, I use a GoPro, and you will see a lot of the footage that I recorded with that little GoPro later on, which was great to have it as a second camera in the background. So that camera can shoot the time lapses, and then with my main camera, I can take the actual photos. A couple of years after I bought that camera, the kit lens, I looked a bit further into astrophotography, and that's when I had to buy a different lens, which a bit of a faster aperture, which is the f2.8 here, to let a little bit more light in there, and also went for a bit of a wider angle to get more of the sky, more of the Milky Way into the shot. And I used that wide angle lens for pretty much all my astrophotography until recently. I'm not sure if there was something wrong with that lens or if something else happened, but for some reason the stars after a couple of years didn't really look as pinpoint sharp anymore, and it definitely wasn't my shooting skills, because I definitely figured that out after a couple of years of shooting. So then I switched to the Samyang lens, which is unfortunately a zoom lens, but it's still a wide angle lens, and it has an even faster aperture. And yeah, it's twice as expensive. I think this one was about $1,200 versus the Takina was about $500. But yeah, very happy with this one. This one is a manual focus lens, but for night photography, that almost doesn't really matter if it's auto or night, because most cameras can't autofocus in the dark on the stars anyway. So you always have to switch to manually anyway to focus. But that might be a whole different topic. I also have something that's called a lens skirt, which is probably something most of you haven't seen. And I'll show you a bit later what that's actually used for. It's basically a little hoodie that you stick with suction caps to a window when you shoot inside a building, and you stick your camera inside that kind of thing here at the top. And that means any of the light that you get from the inside of the building reflecting off the glass will be cut off, and you can get beautiful pictures from inside the building without any reflections on the glass. And then I also have that little Platypod Pro, which is basically a tripod plate, which is handy when you go to locations like churches or other places with tight spaces where you're not allowed to bring a tripod, but you can just get your ball head, screw that ball, grab on that screw there in the middle, and then put your camera on there and yeah, take a couple of pictures. To be honest, I don't use that a lot anymore, but it's still handy to have with you every now and then. It's relatively small and light, and yeah, sometimes yeah, for churches, it's definitely the only thing that you can take with you if you want to mount your camera on something that isn't huge and bulky. In terms of planning my shoots or shots, in terms of like going out and figuring out when does the sun actually look good, where will it be, I use an app called PhotoPills. That gives me all the times in terms of sunrise times, sunrise locations, moonrise, moonset, where the Milky Way is, where the Milky Way core rises, if there's a lunar eclipse or solar eclipse, and a lot of more things to look into. I think that app costs about $15. It's not available on desktop, but on your mobile phone. But I use that pretty much for everything in terms of location planning. Where do I need to look? Where do I need to point my camera? So the $15 or $16 you have to pay for, definitely worth spent. I do have to say at the beginning, it takes a bit of time to get used to it. It's a bit overwhelming, but then once you through that, and there's a lot of tutorials online on YouTube, it actually makes a lot more sense and you will not use anything else anymore. And then in terms of weather, I use another app called Clear Outside, which is a free app. And the good thing about this app is it gives me a number for each different layer of clouds. And the way you read this, I'm not sure if it just looks a bit too complicated. Forget about all the numbers here at the bottom. Just look at the number of the clouds. Basically, for colorful sunrise or sunsets, what you would like to see is a forecast with a high number here in the high cloud section, which is the very fluffy clouds at the very top in the sky. And you don't want any low or medium cloud in your location, which might potentially block the sun on the horizon. So this, for example, is not a good forecast for colorful sunrise or sunset because there's a lot of low and medium cloud. But if it's actually the other way around and you have a lot of high cloud and a lot of zeros on the other side, like we had this morning, there's a high chance of you getting a very colorful sunrise and sunset. So you don't really miss out or don't really set your alarm for nothing when you have to get up very early in the morning. If anyone has any questions about these apps or my gear, feel free to put that in later in the chat. To be honest, I actually don't know if I can operate the screen and the chat at the same time, but we can talk about that later. Or if you have any questions, you see at the bottom of the slide deck on the right-hand side is my website. There's a contact form if you want to send me any questions or contact me on Instagram, which is the handle on the bottom left. I also always put a couple of composition rules in here that I found quite useful over the years, and I'm not really there to teach you that because most of you would probably have heard of those kind of rules, but it's always a great reminder for me to kind of keep these kind of rules or more guides in mind when I go out and I really struggle to find an interesting composition. Thinking about these kind of rules is like, it often helps me to actually come up with something that's a lot more useful than just putting my tripod in the middle of nowhere and pointing it towards the sun. And you'll see a bit later in the slide deck why that is. The first one I want to talk about is kind of the one where you have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background to create depth. I think before I started into photography, this picture would have been taken probably without the foreground element because the main subject is obviously Horsehead Rock down the coast in the background, and that's really what you want to focus at. But including that little kind of watery bit in the foreground really helps to add a bit of depth and kind of add a bit of a 3D effect to that entire image. And now these days, when I shoot photos, I usually try to find something in the foreground to kind of create that depth. It doesn't always work, and you don't obviously have to follow these rules, but I feel like it definitely helps when you structure pictures with kind of these kind of elements in mind, that you look for an interesting foreground, then obviously have or often the foreground can actually be your main subject, but often it will be somewhere in the middle ground, and then obviously have the background, which is often the sky or mountains or something else in the background. The next one is looking for a natural frame that kind of frames the entire image and draws the attention of the viewer towards that main subject, which is obviously here the Sydney Opera House. This is taken from Cremorne Point through a bush. And the viewer, there's the kind of no question asked. You know immediately where you have to look and what the main subject is, because you have the trees kind of framing the entire scene. The next one, very popular one, is leading lines as well. Sometimes they can obviously distract from the main image, but again, this one, it's very easy, or it takes, it's very fast for the viewer to actually realize where you have to look within the image, and you don't really get confused because there's too many elements in the image. The leading line in the foreground here takes you immediately to this main subject, which I guess that was a bit of a creative choice, is out of focus because I focus more on the foreground there. But in terms of composition, it makes the composition itself very easy. And this is a bit of a combination of everything. You have the foreground element, which is that leaflet, somewhere on the roads near Katoomba in the Blue Mountains on a very foggy morning. You got the depth by having the leaf, the middle ground, which is kind of the road, and then the trees and the fog in the background. You have the leading line, and then you also have the trees around the whole scene to kind of frame the entire shot. Another thing that those that follow me on Instagram probably know that a lot, I love reflections in either puddles or in windows, wherever I can find them, getting low with my camera. Obviously, rainy days work very well, and that's why I love Vivid when it actually rains, because everyone else stays at home, and all the photographers usually come out to take pictures in the rain to get those lovely reflections, especially with the lights, and we'll have a picture for that later. And another one, which I actually find quite difficult, but it's also quite powerful, is keeping it simple. To only have very, very few elements in your shot, to keep it as easy as possible for the viewer to actually figure out what's the main subject, what does the photographer want to tell me. And yeah, as I said before, I often find that quite difficult, because often there's a lot of stuff going around and you really want to kind of keep the viewer's attention to one specific subject. And there was actually one recent one that I really like, which is this ferry here. I think that was taken early May on a very, very foggy morning. Yes, I kind of don't really have a foreground element in this right at the bottom, but you can probably argue that the ferry is a bit of a foreground element, or maybe the middle element, and then you have a hint of the harbor bridge in the fog in the background. And I guess keeping that simple and kind of having that kind of mystery in there, and maybe also having the ferry come from the left to the right, which is kind of the natural position, or like the natural direction of where most people read, makes this a very pleasing image to view. That's just my ideas. I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but that's what I'll probably say. Well, this picture may be seen as a beautiful picture by a lot of people. And also, I do also love a lot of architecture. I don't think I have too much architecture in here as well, but symmetry, especially with architecture, is something that really works really well as well when it comes to image composition. I'll just move on to my early stages once I had my DSLR camera, when I bought that back in 2013. And actually, fun fact, before that camera came out, it took me about half a year to agree to spend, I think it was $1,800 back then, to spend that on a piece of technology. And to not waste any time, I actually downloaded the user manual, which was about 450 pages, before, like 6 months before I bought the camera, to give myself enough time to, when I actually have that camera, to actually know exactly what I'm doing. Probably a bit of a weird thing to do, to read through 450 pages of camera manual, but I felt like it actually helped to then know how to operate my camera. And this camera, this photo is one of the earlier ones. I think I had probably the camera for maybe half a year. Once I had that, it's taken down in Cold Cliff. And you will basically, you will see later that I do love a bit of color and saturation. So some of you may find these images a bit too saturated, but that was my style back then, and maybe is still today. But the reason why I actually show you this picture is because I also want to show you the original image, which looked a little bit different and also a bit more boring. So what I did here is I cropped into the surfer to have the surfer on the right-hand side. And then also the main thing why that picture probably worked for me is to put the color in there. So there was a lot of, or a little bit of editing and Lightroom involved to kind of use the complementary colors of the orange in the sky and a bit of a bluer foreground in the water. And I actually do have that, I don't think you can see it. I actually printed that on canvas above my bed in my bedroom as a 1.5 meter wide canvas. And yeah, always reminds me of those kind of early days I had with my camera. I also bought this little Volkswagen Kombi, because obviously German, have to buy German things. And this one was actually a bit of a funny one, because that is actually taken right next to a road, which is kind of that white bit here in the background. But getting really low and putting my actually camera into the grass, and then using a very shallow aperture. Although that's next to a road in a very in a residential area in Mossman, it really helped to kind of focus the attention on that little model. And by getting really low, I mean, it doesn't really look like a real car, but I think it really emphasizes the size of the van. And luckily, I had a white wall behind me, so the sunlight coming directly from in front of me actually reflected off the white wall behind me and gave a bit of an extra glow to that little combi. And I just tried a few different things in terms of getting a bit more creative, figuring out how depth of field works in these early stages, trying to do a little bit of different things. And these are kind of the images I kind of got to in the first years. This one was I think the first time I used my 10-stop filter. That's Milford Sound in New Zealand. Had a lovely sunrise in winter, freezing cold obviously, but it really helped to kind of smooth out that water. Nowadays, I would probably say, I don't know if I would do that in terms of the water, if I would try to get a bit of more definition in it, but definitely liked it back at that time. Beautiful morning. And also, again, the rocks again in the foreground to add kind of that depth of field by having the foreground, middle ground, and background. Then I got a little bit more into actually editing and kind of incorporating that into my workflow and created this kind of image, which was more just a test of like, what can I actually do with Photoshop? So obviously that's my old phone that I had holding in my hand, but it's obviously not see-through, and that the picture you see there, my camera would never, or my phone would never be able to take a picture that looks exactly like the same that I can take with my camera. So what I actually did is I took one camera on one photo on my tripod of the entire scene. I then took a second picture with me holding my hand in there without moving my tripod, and then cut out the inside of the phone later in Photoshop and made that transparent, so the background from the left image actually show through, and then basically just put a bit more editing in there in Lightroom. And what actually happened with this picture, that was just like me trial and error something. I wasn't really happy with the photo, that it was like something too outrageous, but the Illawarra Mercury actually picked that up and printed that as the main image on the entire cover page, which was amazing back then. Obviously, newspaper didn't pay me for that, which is probably a whole other different topic if photographers should get paid for their content, especially when they end up on the cover of a newspaper. But back then, I was just happy that a picture got shared. And then I used that idea to create something a little bit different, which is the picture on the right-hand side here, which was taken at Zigzag in the Blue Mountains. And again, it was probably more in the early stages of my photography, of more playing around with different things and getting used to Photoshop. Because even these days, I would say I'm definitely not a Photoshop with it, but kind of having these kind of smaller projects definitely helped to kind of get used to certain elements within Photoshop. For example, different layers that I had to use for those kind of creations, and also masking different objects from different pictures. And while I would these days not do these kind of pictures anymore, it definitely helped me to create other things later on that do not look that unnatural like they do in these pictures. And actually, this is just a quick behind the scenes story content, how I took these pictures. So I took one picture of the railway line, and then one picture on my rooftop of the phone, and basically merged them, put a bit of a blurry filter around that to create that one. The next kind of thing I really got into, and I showed you that earlier, is obviously those kind of light trails, but what I really wanted to get into is light painting. And I found this tutorial on a website called Digital Photography School, and I got really interested and see if I can actually try that myself. And I went on a holiday into rural Queensland a couple of years ago and created this beautiful image. And I'll show you in a second that is a time-lapse video of how I actually did that. So to create these kind of white lines, over 2 hours, I was walking, or actually it wasn't me, it was a friend of mine, was walking very closely with a torch along the side of where all these lines are, where the white lines are, with a torch, probably about 5 centimeters away from those kind of lines, and trying to replicating those kind of defining lines of that. I don't even know what car that is, maybe a Plymouth or something, of that old car. And then I basically put all these pictures, I actually forgot how many pictures that are, on top of each other, and always only let the lighter bit shine through. And then in the end took one picture with a bit of torchlight from the left-hand side, highlighting kind of the entire side of this car, and then took a separate picture of the sky to get the stars out. And I'll show you the time lapse, how that all looks like. And each picture was, yeah, as you can see there, 30 seconds. So it took a bit of time, and each individual picture itself, not very interesting. But then altogether, and you can actually see the shadow here from my camera here, altogether actually quite an interesting thing. Something I actually haven't tried since. I think that was back in 2017, but definitely love playing around with something a little different and actually trying something that I've read online. Staying within Sydney, one of the early things I got into was storm photography, and that was actually one of my first pictures I took from the rooftop in Neutral Bay, for where I previously lived. And it was one of the first pictures I took of lightning strikes, which I originally thought it was actually rather difficult. But what I did is I set up a time lapse, so telling the camera to take a picture, 30-second exposure, basically right after each other for about an hour. To be honest, this is actually not one single picture. These are actually, or that image is made up of 5 different images. The one on the top left is kind of a general exposure. And then I captured in the one at the top right, the bottom right and the bottom left, I captured each individual lightning strike. And then the one in the back in the middle is just something I wanted to add for the foreground, which was like a ferry or some boat kind of going around within that one. I edited that one. So each of them just boosting the color, putting a bit more clarity in their saturation to make it a bit more lively. And then put them all together again with Photoshops. And if anyone is interested in that, probably a whole other story, how to merge them. That ended up with, and then we ended up with this one. You may realize that the pictures I take are not always, I wouldn't say they're fake, but I often take multiple pictures focusing on different things within the scene and then combining them to create something that I have in mind. Obviously, these lightning strikes didn't happen all at the same time. They probably happened within a 5-minute period. But this is kind of the vision that I had in mind. And that's how I take pictures and still do that these days. This is actually another one, which is funnily taken exactly on the same day. I think it was the 6th, 7th, or 8th of December 2018, and the other one was taken exactly the same day, 6th of December the year before. Often when we get storms here in winter, in summer, that's actually taken from the same rooftop, but in a different direction. And I got lucky, so the storm actually passed me. So it rained for about 10 minutes, but then after that, it was just a freaking light show all over the sky. And I do have another time lapse how that actually looks like. So that's actually an unedited photo from the rooftop. Obviously, shadows are a bit too dark, highlights are a bit too bright, and the saturation, everything is a bit too green in terms of the colors. But this is the time lapse, and you can see the storm traveling out towards Macquarie Lighthouse, which is the one here in the back. And that's the final image, putting them all together. That was a bit more work, getting all those lightning strikes into one image, and I don't think I've ever done that again since. But it was definitely a fun project. And yeah, to me, very powerful image to capture like 1 hour of storm in one image. The next one, I'm not sure if you can actually hear sound. Someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear the sound. Could anyone hear sound? No sound. Okay, maybe that's just that, maybe not connected this way. But I mean, the sound doesn't really matter. But basically, it was a couple of shell clouds rolling into Sydney. And here's another one without sound, probably doesn't make too much sense. But what happened here is there was actually a lightning strike that hit basically down here right in front of me. And there was one of those moments where I was stuck at home and I was thinking about going on my rooftop, but luckily I was smart enough to stay inside because that's actually where the lightning strike happened, and it was rather close to me. And later that night, that storm, that was actually one of the huge shelf clouds that rolled directly from the south of Sydney towards me. That was taken in 2015. Panorama was a vertical panorama. I often shoot panoramas as a vertical panorama. So I think it was 5 or 6 different images to capture as much of the sky here at the top and the bottom, rather than shooting horizontal images and then merging them together. Funnily, a couple of years later, I came home with a ferry and I saw something at the horizon that looked, again, very similar to those kind of shell clouds that I saw 3 years earlier. So I got quite excited. I ran up to my rooftop, checked the weather app, saw there's this huge rain cloud coming towards me, set up my GoPro, and then actually, once I was set up, I saw the same similar or very similar storm cloud heading my way. And here's a nice panorama of how it looks with my phone, which is actually quite scary to see that, and actually gets quite windy up there as well. So that's where I try to stand on, but as I said, it was quite windy. The GoPro, in terms of the time lapse, blew over. Storm got closer, so it was really quite scary. It got a lot darker. Position, the GoPro fell over, so I actually had to secure that on another chair. Got quite wet, but it was actually quite fun. So obviously shooting into the wind with the rain towards my lens wasn't the best idea, but I still got something which I'll show you in a minute. And this is also what happened. Probably not the smartest idea to stand on a rooftop with a lightning strike on the left-hand side, but at least I wasn't stupid enough to hold an umbrella above me to give the lightning strike something to target. Still happy days. I think I got a few shots. And then what happened actually afterwards is, often when we get interesting storms just before sunset, often those storms roll through and there is often a chance for a very beautiful sunset. And that actually what happened, I think it was 45 minutes later, the entire horizon just blew up with this amazing orange, red, yellowish glow. And it's just actually something I didn't really expect at that time, but it looked absolutely beautiful to see those kind of colors after the storm cloud came through. Obviously got a bit wet. And then here you see the actually comparison, very similar composition, but the comparison between the two shots, one taken in 2015 and one in 2018. And here's the final image, which actually some people say looks a bit like a lips, a bit of like a, obviously without the lipstick, but yeah, mouth opening up above the city. And maybe I can take my headphones out and see how that works in terms of sound. Can you hear the sound now?
Yes.
So I'll stop that here, and then got lucky enough a couple of years later. Similar one, this one was also from the same rooftop, but coming in from more the west. But I think in my 10 years here in Sydney, I've only seen 4 of those in the entire time. Very rare, but very, very spectacular if you're in the right location for these kind of clouds coming through. And then again, same with this one, couple of minutes or like half an hour later, we had a beautiful sunset. Once that storm rolled over, with the light and the color. I think this one was taken 45 minutes after sunset, and it doesn't happen often that you get this amazing light that late after sunset. But yeah, absolutely beautiful to watch.
Breckwoldt photography. Look at that shot cloud building across Sydney. If you have them, folks, share them with you on Instagram.
So this one I actually got lucky, and I think that was my first appearance on TV. That happened, I think it was last year, in 2020, and that was with this image, a bit of a different shelf cloud, but also similar concept, panorama, vertical panorama. I think 5 or 6 different images shot from our rooftop, and yeah, it's always a lot of luck involved to be in the right position at the right time to get these kind of things. moving away from storms and moving into sunset photography. Anyone, any idea where this one was taken from? There was the one hint, it was not taken from a helicopter. That would not be so good. Yeah, well done, Vito. Yeah, it was taken from Sydney Tower, and this is where actually the lens skirt I mentioned earlier comes in handy, because you would think like shooting through glass, you wouldn't get such a clear image. And there's actually something else that is a bit different with this image that I'll explain in a second. So I'll first show you how I actually took this photo. So this is my camera in that lens skirt to block out any of the light and the reflection coming from in the tower, the building behind me, and to not carry my tripod up on top of the tower. I'm actually not sure if you're allowed to bring your tripod. You probably are, but I didn't want to carry my tripod around. I used that little platypod tripod plate and mounted my bowl head on top of that. So I was shooting through that lens skirt to block out any reflections. And what I first did, I took one picture just before sunset and edited that one. But what I didn't like is that there's nice color on the horizon, the clouds look lovely, but the city looked a bit boring. So something I do actually do quite a lot is I often take a picture a bit later. This one was about 20 minutes after sunset, where you have the lights in the buildings and you have the lights on the road. So you have those lights all lit up, which you usually don't get during sunset. So most of the times when you shoot sunset, by the time the lights come on in these buildings or whatever you have around them with artificial lights, the color is already gone by the time the lights come on. So I edited this one, and then basically what I do is I take the sky or the color from the sunset and combine that to take that into this combined photo. Again, some people may say it's fake or not because it didn't actually happen at the same time, but I kind of use it as my creative freedom and always feel like it kind of makes it look a little bit better where you have the nice color in the sky, but also the lights in the building. And perfect rule of thirds. If you'd use those lines, hopefully you've heard that kind of composition rule before. Lining that up perfectly. This one was another example of a sunset shot with a nice colorful sunset. I think it was 2 years ago from Bradley's Head. And again, this is a good example for where the color in the sky is amazing, but the foreground is all a bit dark and a bit boring. So same as with the previous picture, what I did is take a second picture a bit later, once the lights are switched on. And then for the final image, merge both of those pictures together. Obviously, I brighten up the first picture a bit more. And in this case, to kind of take the attention away from the water, I also used, I think it's called a motion blur filter to make the water a bit smoother. I didn't want to make it as smooth as you would see in the second image because you lose a bit of detail in the image. I actually like a little bit of those kind of waves and ripples in there. But that's, again, my creative freedom and up to everyone to judge if that's good photography or not, but that's kind of the style I do. But yeah, those that maybe know me from Instagram know that I do kind of this kind of style quite a lot, that I shoot one picture at sunset and one picture 20 minutes later to get those kind of lights in the building in the shot and then put them together. And if you know a little bit about Photoshop, it's actually very, very easy to kind of blend them together with a layer blend mode called Lighten. So you don't actually have to do too much work later on, but that we can talk about that in a different session. Let's move back into night photography and into long exposure photography and a couple of vivid shots. Those that shoot Canon may know the Canon Collective group that Canon has, where they run events, or they actually stopped that during COVID and kind of made all the ambassadors redundant. But back in 2016, they offered a helicopter tour, and I was lucky enough to be one of those lucky persons that get into those helicopters. And shooting handheld out of a moving helicopter in the middle of the night with outdoors wasn't the most pleasant experience. Obviously, it was cold because it was in winter. Luckily, they gave us a very fancy camera. I think it was the 1DX something back then that just launched in 2016. And they also gave us a gyro, which is basically like a vibrating device that counterbalances the vibration of the helicopter in the air, because you can imagine shooting out of a moving helicopter that's vibrating in the middle of the night without a tripod, not a good idea. But that camera shooting at high ISO, having a very fast lens, and having the gyro actually made it possible to shoot these kind of pictures from the sky. And again, it was something that I wanted to shoot that not a lot of other people can shoot doing Vivid. And there's a bit of a theme in terms of me trying to do different things for the Vivid, and we'll get to that in a minute as well. Next one, similar to what I mentioned before, what I like is getting low, getting reflections. This one, the left one is taken from Luna Park, and the right one is just on the other side of Sikaliki at Kirribilli. And I want to talk to you or show you actually a bit more of how I edited that shot. This is actually the initial shot I took once I set up my camera. I put it on my platypod. Had the first person walking in. I kind of didn't really see that person, but then got a bit of noise that a second person walked in. But I thought, well, while she's holding up her phone, actually might be a good opportunity to get her, as long as she stands still long enough, to see if I can actually get that picture with her in the shot. Obviously, that sign is a bit distracting. So again, a bit of Photoshop work involved to get that removed. But then actually boosting up the vibrance and everything else in that picture helped to create this beautiful picture, which I actually quite like because it kind of represents of what Vivid is all about, something very colorful. And this is kind of a good example of what I meant earlier with go out when it rains, because that's when you get all those puddles and the lovely reflections, and you don't have too many other people out there. But that was kind of like a thing in terms of, if you look actually at the settings here, it's probably not really a scene you should normally shoot at f8 at a very shallow depth of field. And I probably wouldn't print that as a large print because it probably hasn't the sharpness that you would normally expect from the picture that you print. But having the f2.8 aperture then really helped me to get that very fast shutter speed of 1 second to ensure the person who's standing there with the phone is actually sharp enough and doesn't move, because yeah, a second later she actually took her phone down and walked away. So that shot would have not been possible if I took a 30-second exposure, or I would have had to tell her, hey, can you please stand still for 30 seconds? But probably that would have ruined the whole thing. Here's another thing of what I've started doing Vivid in terms of getting kind of a different angle than most people get. And I hired a room in the Shangri-La Hotel and shot from the Shangri-La with a couple of friends. Again, you can see the lens skirt set up there. Started doing sunset, then it gets darker and darker, and then the lights come on, because from there you get a beautiful view. And let me get to the next one. Out the window. And I actually had that first week or the first night I shot, I actually had 4 different cameras. I shot over 3.5 gigabyte worth of photos, or actually this one was, there's a lot more. This photo alone was actually a combination of 21 raw files. For this one, I actually borrowed a 5D from Canon to try this shot, which is, yeah, as I said before, 21 images all lined up together to get this beautiful view through the windows. Again, the lens skirt helped massively to cut out any reflections or any lights from inside the room. Obviously, we kept the room dark to really create this. And then I went back there every single year. I think 2 years ago, I created this one, which I got lucky enough, Vivid Sydney, that account actually featured this image as well. And what I actually started doing is to share these rooms with other photographers. We actually get to that in a minute. Funnily, like obviously I stayed there the night as well because I paid for the room. But I also started to do a few silly things like trying to pretend to be a pretty person in a morning robe there, because a lot of other people that stay there and post pictures from that location do these kind of weird stage photos that supposed to look very natural of someone just looking out the window and just, I don't know. I thought I'd make a bit of fun of it, but the Shangri-La Hotel actually picked up on that and put my picture on their own account, which was kind of an interesting thing to see. And nothing I really expected them to do, because obviously they run a business, they make money of it, and usually it's a bunch of pretty girls, sometimes with a lot of clothes on, that sit in these windows and trying to hold a glass of champagne or something. But maybe they wanted to show a man as well, and they kind of saw this funny side in that as well. But kind of doing this kind of thing, they actually got talking to me, and I got to meet the managing director and the marketing director from the Shangri-La. We kind of developed a bit of a relationship. And what happened out of me sitting in the window, basically me getting to talk to them, is they invited me to shoot New Year's Eve from their rooftop, which is totally off limits for even the staff working there on New Year's Eve. That was the New Year's Eve when we had the bushfires, so it was not really sure if we can actually, if the fireworks will actually go ahead. So they signed me up to basically provide the official content for them with 2 of my friends. So we got a lot of cameras together, a lot of tripods together. You can imagine shooting fireworks. Anyone who's done that is a very stressful thing because you never know how high the fireworks are, how fast they are, if the smoke is moving in your direction, if it's all getting ruined or not. And they obviously wanted the pictures because they got me up there. So I had to deliver, which was quite stressful. They wanted a picture, a vertical shot and the horizontal shot of the bridge, of the opera house, an overall scene and a video of that. So doing all of that with one camera obviously wouldn't be possible. So I got my friends together and we all chipped in together and got a lot of gear together. But luckily I know a few people that helped out, so I was very grateful for that. And in the end ended up with that photo, which they absolutely loved from up there. Again, I do have to admit, this is not a single shot. Probably each of the fireworks you see there is one separate shot, and I blended them together. And also I took one shot of the entire scene, probably a couple of minutes before the fireworks went off, to not have any smoke in there at all. And often the fireworks, because they're so much brighter than the rest of the scene, you would normally underexpose your shot as well. So the highlights in the fireworks don't blow out, and the rest of the scene would usually be too dark. So that's why I think it's probably 5 or 6 different images. But yeah, absolutely stoked with this one that I got the opportunity to shoot from up there, which I'll probably never have again for New Year's Eve. And that actually delivered that as well, because it was definitely a very stressful experience getting all the cameras ready, getting them all set up. And obviously I can only operate one camera at a time. So I had to set up a lot of time lapses and then get the settings right. I was practicing for the 9 o'clock firework to see how that works. So yeah, but absolutely stoked with that. And what happens this year is I got 2 rooms again for Vivid. And I'm actually opening up those rooms for other photographers as well. So if anyone is interested to shoot Vivid from those rooms as well, I've booked 2 nights, which are the opening nights this year for Vivid. I have room for 8 photographers for each session, and I have 2 sessions. One session is from 4 p.m. till 8 p.m. to get the sunset, which at that time is about, I think, 20 past 5. And then from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. you can actually shoot 2 hours of the Vivid lights. Or you go for the second session, which is from 8:15 to when the lights switch off at 8 p.m. Yeah, feel free to either scan that code with your phone or also go to my website. The link here is at the bottom, is my name, janbreckwoldt.com. And if you go to store here at the top and then go to workshops, you see this Vivid workshops. So I still have a couple of spots available. I haven't really put that on Instagram yet, so you're kind of the first people that see this kind of stuff. And because I have that relationship with the Vivid Hotel, they actually gave me a room in the top 6 levels. So it's one of the rooms is in level 29, and the other room is between level 30 and 35. So we definitely get a good vantage point up there. And if you go on my website and click through all the other images, you see more of the behind the scene content. And also the links here on the website. So if you want to scan this with your phone, you get directly to that page. Or if you want to just look at that later, just find me on Google or on Instagram and click on my website. And then you can go through that as well. But let's actually get away from Sydney and look into a couple of other things I've done in the early years of my photography career, which was sleeping in the back of my car a lot. So I actually have a Volkswagen Golf. Again, German, have to drive and buy German stuff. But I'm 6'1" or 184 centimeters. So sleeping in the back of my Volkswagen Golf, as you can imagine, is not the most pleasant experience. But because I'm shooting a lot of night photography and sunrise, sunset, I'm a bit of a penny pincher. And I don't want to spend money for a hotel where I only sleep for like 3 hours in. So I often drive to location, and I'm that comfortable or fancy that I actually get my eye mask, which is from Emirates, and a little pillow because I don't want to have a sore neck. And then, yeah, I sleep in the back of my Golf, leave my camera outside sometimes, or take it inside to get up early in the morning. But a couple of years ago, Canon organized a workshop in the Stockton sand dunes, just north of Newcastle. And the first shot was, or one of the shots I've taken on the first event I went there, which is a place called Tin City. I actually don't remember the exact history. If that was a couple of people that after the Second World War came back and didn't really have enough money to rent or buy a house in the city, but basically built their own sheds out in the dunes, or if that was a scene that was built for Mad Max. I don't think that was for Mad Max, but yeah, definitely something worth checking out. I think it's about 10, 20 kilometers in from Anna Bay, from the northern end. So you can walk, takes quite a long time, but Canon organized a guided tour towards that, which was interesting because what you can't see in this photo is there's probably 50 photographers all lined up next to me, which totally ruined the scene. But obviously, if you focus directly on that shed, you can kind of cut them all out. But what didn't really happen that morning was getting a really colorful sunrise. There's a bit of pink in the clouds, but it wasn't actually a very pretty one. So I booked another session I think it was the year after, and to come back, and the sky looked absolutely boring. Like, we got out there 30 minutes before sunrise, we all set up, same shed, but there was absolutely no color, and I was not inspired at all. So I was trying to find basically a composition that would work, that would make that interesting regardless of the sky and the weather condition. And as you remember from my composition rules or guides I mentioned earlier, I often look for something interesting in the foreground. So I was running around. There was actually a bit of color in the sky. It wasn't amazing, but at least there was something. And I knew that color wouldn't last long. So I was kind of panicking a little bit to see where I would actually find a decent composition that would look different to what I shot before. So running around, eventually got low, because often getting low kind of gives you a bit of a different perspective. And I tried to put something in the foreground, which is kind of those kind of grassy bit, but it all looked very, very messy, and definitely not something I would put in the category of keeping it simple, what I talked about earlier. Had a bit of a sunburst, but again, I found that picture a bit too messy, just too much going on. Color wasn't great. And yeah, almost, I think the sun was up, and normally I would pack up, but I thought I'll just look around a bit further, and eventually found something that I thought looks actually quite cool, which was this kind of bit of piece of metal or collarbond in the sand. I thought that might be a cool element. So I first put up my camera into the sand, obviously making sure that there's no sand going into the camera itself or in the lens as well. And actually then just next to it, I found something else. And instead of having a picture that would look like this, which is probably the view you have if you stand to it and you stand up, if you actually get low, you change your perspective, and it actually automatically looks different because it's not on eye level. I actually found something way better, which is this little stick there, and I have a different picture in there, and that's kind of the final image in terms of composition that I was actually happy with. And I talk about the composition in a bit of a second. The only problem was that by the time I found this composition, the color was gone, the sun was already up, and everything was a bit too harsh. The light was already up there, and yeah, there's too much contrast between the darks and the brighter parts. So I had to do a bit of magic in Lightroom and play around with colors, which again is, I guess, my style. Not everyone has to like that, but that's how I try to make photos work. So played around with a few sliders, probably the usual Lightroom editing flow I do, opening up the shadows, turning down the highlights and adding a bit more color to it. But then I played around with a lot of filters in Lightroom to really draw the viewer's attention to the parts that actually light. So you can see here that I made the kind of everything that's around that stick and around that shed a lot darker, because that's not interesting at all. I don't want the viewer to focus on these kind of things. And then I brighten up the things that are actually interesting enough for the viewer to look at. Put more circles around there, brighten up that shed in the background, because naturally a viewer's eyes usually goes to the brightest part in the image. So you usually want to make sure that whatever's brightest in the image is actually the main subject of your image, or at least something interesting, so it doesn't distract from the main part of the image. And then I just moved a few distractions. That was actually footsteps from people walking through the sand, and that's the final image. Again, the color did not look like this. I showed you the previous one, how it originally looked like that. But in terms of the composition, I really like that composition because actually have this. It's a very simple composition. There's only mainly two elements that stick in the foreground and the shed in the background. So it makes it very easy for the viewer to kind of understand what to look at, compared to something like this, where it's like there's a lot of grass, a lot of distraction around, way too messy, doesn't really work. The next thing is in terms of composition, it also has the depth by having something in the foreground, then the middle ground, and then the shed in the background or the sky in the background. So it makes it a bit more 3D. And you can even argue that there might be a bit of a leading line in there, a bit of like a zigzag line that kind of, the first thing you see also because it's in focus is that branch in the foreground, and then it kind of guides the viewer to the back of the image towards that shed. And also, I guess, for someone that just scrolls through Instagram, what I spend most of my time on, maybe something that people look a little bit longer because it naturally guides the eye a bit deeper into the actual image. Happy Jan, or happy Jane, however you want to call that. So let's travel a bit further out of Sydney and surroundings and travel further south towards the snowy mountains. I think this trip is from 2017 or 2018. I've seen a similar composition with the sunburst previously, and I got lucky that I got a clear sky. I set my camera to, I think, f14 or f16 to get that nice light. And then if you break the sun, if you find it like an edge where you can break the sun, that actually creates that nice starburst effect. And I was quite happy with that. So the next year I came back, I kind of thought I'll try something different. But because I spend a lot of time on Instagram, these days I shoot a lot of vertical shots, because Instagram, to film more of your screen on your phone, obviously features or vertical shots a lot, or they look a lot better because you film more real estate on the phone. So next thing I started was trying to get a similar composition, but as a vertical shot. Shooting wide angle, not a good thing when you don't have a clean lens. But I found a beautiful composition that looks a little bit similar. I got the shadows as leading lines in there, got the nice starburst effect in here, and it ended up with this image. Probably a bit too yellow for my liking these days, and I did add a bit of warmth to it to really add to the feeling of that image that I wanted to create. The reason why I put that in there is because, again, I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things that worked for me, or where I think why this image works and may look pleasing for some people, which is first, again, the leading lines. And the leading lines also point you to the main subject of the image, which is obviously that sunburst on the right-hand side. Also, having the sunburst on the right-hand side is, again, the natural flow of people reading from left to right. It kind of follows the natural flow and then points the person looking at the image to the main subject. And then the sun itself, being the brightest subject in the entire image, automatically draws attention to it. So I think that's those kind of three elements combined are probably one of the reasons why you would say this is maybe I don't know, an image that's pleasing to watch. And I'm going a bit further into the Blue Mountains. This is actually on the way to Mount Kosciuszko. That's just probably about half an hour from Breckwoldt chairlift. Going up there, anyone who's been there, it's not on the main pass. It's called North Ram's Head. Yeah, I think North Ram's Head. Quite a popular photography location, so not something I can claim credit for. So I knew exactly where I had to go. It was a bit difficult to find, but eventually I got up there. I was there all by myself, which was a bit scary, which was, I think it was Easter a couple of years ago. So it wasn't that warm, but it also wasn't freezing, and luckily we didn't have any snow. But the interesting part with this picture is actually, it's not the sun. So you may have realized there are a lot of whiter lines here in the sky, which are actually the stars, which actually give it away that the bright point you have here is the moon. Because if you have the sun up in the sky that high, you would not see any stars anymore. And I'll talk you through of how this one came apart. I did that. So I knew there was a full moon rising by the time I got up there, which was probably, I think it was, yeah, must have been the Easter weekend. Oh yeah, 2018 year. So this is, again, from the app PhotoPills that I used earlier, which kind of gives you a screen that overlays the actual view that you see in real life. And it tells you exactly where the moon is and where the moon will rise, just looking through your phone, pointing it towards the horizon line. So before that, I tried to shoot sunrise, sunset, but there were no clouds, so it wasn't really very interesting. So kind of moved away from that, and then moved around the corner, and there was actually the full moon rising on the other side behind the rocks. And luckily, I got a very nice lens from one of my friends. I think it was a 100 to 400 lens. And when you shoot with a 400 lens, you realize the moon actually moves rather fast. It's very difficult to get everything focused and not have any motion blur, and then get it all set up and line up. But yeah, it was quite beautiful to watch. And then the foreground became darker and darker, and the moon move quicker up into the sky, changed from orange to white. And by that time, it was already too difficult to shoot. So I moved back to my original position, just waited a bit longer, took a few funny selfies with the moonlight up there. As I said before, I was there alone, so I had to entertain myself to not get too bored. But then I actually saw this, that the moon was perfectly lined up with that rock formation I saw there. So I took again multiple pictures to make that scene work, because the moon was so bright. For getting the moon not overexposed, I had to darken it down a bit, which meant the foreground was way too dark. So I took one picture for the foreground, a bit of a longer exposure, and one picture for the background. Let me just go through this. And that was the final image to that. So the foreground is one image with the the stars here, and then the background with the moon was another picture merged together. So again, something that you may not see that often with the stars and the moon as a moonburst effects, because often you have that with the sun. But yeah, quite happy with that. Interesting part was actually I slept up there in my sleeping bag just behind the rocks here on the right hand side, because I didn't want to go back down and then go back up for sunrise, and the chairlift obviously wasn't operating at those hours of the day. So I had a very windy, cold night up there. But luckily, what happened in the morning when I got up, which was very, very early, there were a few clouds on the horizon. So I got actually quite excited to see if there's anything I can work with better than sunset. I had the moon behind me, which was actually quite interesting. This is now the moon setting behind me, not rising, it's setting behind me. So what that meant is I had this beautiful scene. So I had the sun in front of me and the moonlight from behind me. And the moonlight behind me actually helped to light up the entire scene. So often when you shoot into the sun, you probably know that, similar to what you can see in the middle image here, is that the foreground itself is quite dark. But with the moon behind me, that actually helped to brighten up the foreground a little bit and make that scene a lot more interesting. And that is the final image. Again, maybe these days quite saturated and maybe a bit too colorful, but there was definitely pink and orange in the sky. And yeah, what I really liked here was the moonlight coming from probably a bit to the left of the camera, which almost looks a bit like someone put up like a big soft light box up there. But yeah, normally you don't really get this beautiful light in the foreground, because the light coming from the sun would be way too harsh and the foreground would just be dark, and you would have to either bracket it or take multiple pictures, or maybe put a graduate filter in the sky to really deal with this different light. But yeah, the moonlight behind me really helped to make this picture work. Let's travel around and show you a couple of other pictures. This was me in the Blue Mountains. Actually, something I didn't realize for a lot of years living here is that just right down between probably Bell's Line of Road and Blackheath, you've got these beautiful canyons, which are just right below the lookouts. Very difficult to get into, and obviously a bit dangerous if you don't have the equipment and don't have the guides. But it's absolutely amazing down there, and yeah, very beautiful to walk through. But definitely recommend doing a guided tour. Obviously, you have to dress up in a wetsuit. You may even have to swim, so it's definitely cold. Wouldn't recommend it for everyone, but yeah, very beautiful down there. Another beautiful location is up near Pocolbin or Singleton in the Hunter Valley, which is a place called Little Paddock Chapel, which I think I also found through Instagram with a couple of other people, and we went up there. We were actually supposed to shoot Astro there, the Milky Way, and the forecast was actually clear. We arrived a bit earlier, and there's a huge storm rolling through, but then just after the storm, we had an amazing sunset come up, and yeah, that's where I shot this picture, which was shot with a 10-stop filter to make really those fluffy, stretchy clouds there. It was about a 2-minute exposure, and yeah, I got really lucky with the colors there. We talked about this one earlier, again, not in the Glowworm channel, and please, if you try this at home, please be careful and don't hurt yourself. And obviously canola season, I think it's probably between August and October, very popular. I think there's there's an area called Canola Trail, which is down near Wagga, just north of Wagga in Juni. I think it's Juni, Tamora, and there's another place. Lots of canola fields around, very beautiful to watch. And yeah, it often then comes down to finding a beautiful composition, which often for me is this lone tree in the middle of the field to keep it as simple as possible. I think also why this one worked again is having the contrast between the complementary colors the blue sky, again with the polarizer filter, made a bit bluer than it would normally look, and then having that nice yellow field in the foreground, and that one simple tree. Again, simple composition, but I think it's very powerful. You could probably argue if it's smart to put the tree right dead in the center. If you talk about rules of third, you might want to push it to the right or not. But in terms of rules of third, you can probably see that I have 2/3 of sky at the top and 1/3 at the bottom. So at least I follow that guide. And then I guess maybe I went for a bit more symmetry, putting the tree right in the center. But that's always personal preferences. And those kind of guidelines I mentioned, or rules I mentioned before, they're not really there to be followed every single time, but obviously a guide to help you to kind of create a bit of a better composition. And then what I always do there when I'm out in the country, in rural New South Wales, is look up into the night sky and see that beautiful Milky Way setting. And what's actually quite interesting here is that was probably like an hour after sunset, which is why you have still a bit of a nice glow on the horizon from the sun, behind the horizon line. I think that was a 2 or 3 picture panel. I do have to say it's not the sharpest. You probably see that at the very top. Like here, it looks a bit fuzzy. I will blame that on my old lens, but still happy to kind of see that Milky Way out there and be able to photograph it out in the clear sky. And I do have a whole other section about that in a sec, which we look into now. Just show you a time lapse from a couple of locations. That's the moon, by the way, rising. The sun would be way too bright and you wouldn't see any stars anymore. But that's always exciting when you have a moonrise with Milky Way. And it's not the full moon, because the full moon would be way too bright for these kind of things. I think it was maybe 20 or 30% bright of moon. So definitely interesting one. And this is actually what I love to do the most, is those kind of getting out there, getting out in the middle of the night, see the Milky Way rise and set up time lapses. And unfortunately, I do not have a second camera yet. So once you set up the time lapse, you can't move it for hours, or I usually leave it running for at least 2 hours and just stand around in the cold. That's when it helps to go out with other people, so you have someone to chat to, and it doesn't get too boring. But what you actually get after the end of those 2 hours is like, yeah, that amazing movement of the Earth rotation, or the Earth rotation, and seeing how the Milky Way moves through the sky in the night. And anyone interested, I'm part of a Facebook group called Sydney Astrophotographers, with a couple of other friends, where we share a lot of images, tips and tricks. People can ask questions. You don't have to be from Sydney for that. If anyone is interested in that, feel free to join. And yeah, for any beginners, it's good to learn from other people, but yeah, feel free to ask questions there as well. And I'm one of the moderators with a couple of my friends there. The Facebook group is called Sydney Astrophotographers. And this is where I really learned kind of to get the most out of my camera in the last couple of years, because my camera is already 8 years old now. So the sensor is not the best anymore. It's still good, but it lacks a bit of dynamic range, and especially when you shoot astro, you have to shoot at very high ISO. So most of my pictures are either taken at 3200 or 6400 ISO, and most pictures would get quite grainy, especially when you shoot with a crop sensor camera instead of a full frame camera. Also when it's a bit of a lower entry model camera. So what I've done here is, for these kind of pictures, I got into an editing style or technique called stacking, where you take, for these pictures, I talk about 20 images right after each other. Each of them are probably between 15 and 20 seconds long, and I put them on top of each other. And you can actually put them then in a software that maps out the noise, because the noise stays the same while the stars move out through the sky. So the camera actually knows where the software actually knows where the noise is, and removes that automatically. And I show that to you in a minute as well. And that really helps to bring out all these details, all those kind of gases and nebulas that you see on the right-hand image, which is, by the way, taken in Bombo near Cayama, with the Milky Way core rising behind those kind of stacks there. And you really get to see all those kind of nebulas. And I think this is called Antares. And really get into that, which I actually didn't think was possible with my camera, but it's kind of amazing what you can actually get out of those raw files in there. And anyone interested in that kind of stuff, I can probably talk about astrophotography in a whole other session, or you can invite one of my friends called Matt Hudson, who I learned most of my stuff from. Definitely worth going out for. And also, if you're interested in terms of planning, like where to point your camera, how to focus in the dark, where the Milky Way will be at certain times of the year, because that always changes. Feel free to hit me up, or we can do another session about astrophotography another time as well. And now we're actually coming into the good part of the astro season here in Sydney in winter, because now the Milky Way core will be pretty much on the horizon, like you see on the left-hand side, from a lot earlier in the evening. It gets actually earlier and earlier towards July, August. That right after sunset, once it's dark enough to shoot out east, you already have the Milky Way core, so you don't actually need to wait until midnight or so to kind of get these type of images. But again, the whole astro thing, whole other session. That's at the Parkes Telescope out in Parkes. Every year there's an Astro Fest organized by an astronomer called David Malin. And we were lucky enough that I think it was 3 years ago to actually get on the ground in the middle of the night and to shoot those kind of images. On the right-hand side, they switched off the lights. And seeing that telescope move through the sky, as you saw in the time lapse, very beautiful sight, and very lucky to shoot there. This is actually a bit of another technique I got into, which is called star trail photography, which works similar to time-lapse photography. You set up your camera, let it shoot for a couple of hours, and then you capture basically the Earth rotation. And what I've done here is I pointed my camera directly south towards the south celestial pole. And that gives you kind of that kind of circle there in the middle. And I lined that up with a tree, which is taken in Tasmania at the Bay of Fires. And while that camera was actually taking pictures for 2 hours, I was sleeping on the rocks in the foreground because I couldn't be bothered standing there by myself, and it was in the middle of the night. But again, requires patience, but you get some very interesting images when you point your camera directly south and then combine all these images. Again, probably could talk about that for a whole other session, but I actually do have a post-processing tutorial, just a quick time lapse, but how I process these images. So what I'm doing here is I'm blending in the light from the lighthouse at the top, because it's obviously way too bright if you shoot that at astro settings. So I shot a separate shot, which is a bit underexposed, but correctly exposed for the lighthouse. I got rid of the planes that were going through the shot. And also there was a couple of other photographers running around at the bottom. You can see the torches there. So that's always a fun fact when you actually go out with other photographers. Yes, it's nice to have the company, but they're also bloody annoying when they get in your shot or have their little camera light there. So that required a bit of additional work in Photoshop. And that's where doing everything I did at the very early stages, what I showed you with my phone, that really helped me to kind of get to know Photoshop, to exactly prepare myself for projects like that. And the rest was a bit of dodge and burning, put a bit of a vignette around it, and that's the final image. Probably a bit hectic, and yeah, I'm not sure if it's really pleasing for everyone, but yeah, I kind of like this kind of star trail photography. The next technique I sometimes get into when I shoot astro is taking panoramas to get the arch in basically one shot. So that's, I think, a 180-degree panorama. And what I basically do is I take pictures pretty much almost of the entire sky. It's like I take it in different rows, probably like 6 horizontal or vertical shots in one row, and I move the camera slightly up, cover the same thing, and go up and go up and go up. So basically have probably 40 to 50 different images. And yes, the Milky Way moves in that time, but there's an interesting software called Microsoft Image Composite Editor, Microsoft ICE, which is very good for those kind of panorama Milky Way shots. And basically what you do is you just select all these images, you put that in the software called Microsoft ICE, and the software pretty much does it all on its own. I found that to work a lot better than any panoramas in Lightroom and Photoshop, but maybe Photoshop or Lightroom have caught up to that in the meantime. But this software, Microsoft ICE, works quite well, and it's free. To be honest, I don't know if it works on Apple, on Macs, but yeah, for me on my PC, it actually works quite well. You do have to, when you go into panoramas, have to select a certain projection mode. And I can probably do another whole tutorial about this, but I just really quickly want to show you different steps. This image here is basically, I took a lot more images here of the entire sky, way more than what I actually needed, and it looks a bit distorted. But what you do is you basically crop in, add a few more pictures for the foreground, and then you get to this final image, which is taken at West Head Lookout in Ku-ring-gai National Park, looking towards the east, and this little white, this little dot here, that's Barrenjoey Lighthouse. So normally at night, the gate is actually close to that park, but there was, I don't know which month it was taken, but the security guys opened up the gate a bit earlier than they would normally do. And it was still, you can see the sunrise behind Barrenjoey Lighthouse here. It was still early enough that it was dark enough for me to shoot the Milky Way. I actually got there to shoot sunrise, but because the sky was so clear and there was a lot of clouds later on the horizon, actually sunrise was pretty boring. And all the other photographers that showed up later didn't really get anything good. But luckily I arrived a bit earlier to get them the astro shot, which was a bit unexpected when you go out for sunrise to shoot astro. But I think it was definitely worth it to try something different and kind of get arch in there. This one was shot during the bushfire season. Now, I'm not sure if that's why, because there was so much smoke in the sky. This was probably like an hour and a half before sunrise, that there was such a kind of an orange glow on the horizon at Barrenjoey Lighthouse in Palm Beach. But yeah, I put this one in the presentation because, again, it's something that you don't see that often, where you have the Milky Way in the sky, but then you also have that glow from the early sunrise in the same shot. And I'll show you the time lapse of how that all came together. And anyone who's done video before may know that to create 1 second of video, you need to take 30 images. So this was probably a 15-second video. So you can imagine how many pictures you have to take to get a video that looks smooth to the naked eye. And for that, you need about 24 to 30 images per video second. And each picture is probably a 15 seconds exposure. So quite a long time to get that set up. And I mean, the setup is pretty easy. You put it on a time lapse. You have an intervalometer, either inbuilt or the remote control externally attached to your camera. And then the camera basically takes pictures in whatever interval you tell it automatically. So I don't have to stand there and press the shutter every 15 seconds. I would probably get very bored in that. But it is definitely worth it, because I think these kind of Milky Way time lapses look very beautiful, and it's exactly what I mentioned at the very early beginning. It's something that the naked eye can't see, and this is something that you can actually make visible with the camera, which you otherwise can't, and that's why I love astrophotography that much. But let's actually get a bit further and actually travel out of New South Wales and go towards Tasmania. I'm not sure if anyone's been at the lavender fields. I forgot the name of that very famous estate in the northeast of Tasmania, but I was there a couple of years ago in January, and I was probably a little bit too late, because as you can see in this picture, the lavender probably maybe 2 weeks too late. I think it usually is in season between mid-December and mid-January. But I thought I'd end up there anyway. It was a very hot day. It was 44 degrees, which is probably for Tasmania very, very hot. And most tourists leave about 5 o'clock when they kind of finish their tours and close the shop. But I knew that the owners of the farm, they're usually pretty lenient in terms of leaving photographers out there in the field. So I hang around until about 8:30 when there was sunset in January. So this looked pretty boring. The entire sky, this entire day, we had this overcast weather, was pretty boring. I was running around trying to find interesting composition in case the sky does go off for sunset. And yeah, I had to sit around in my car in the heat for 4 hours. But I thought, well, while I'm here, I could go back to my hotel and have a sleep, because I was pretty tired, but I'm only here for one night, so I don't want to waste the chance. So I stayed. And then at the end, just before sunset, there was a small little gap on the horizon. And I saw there was actually enough space for the sun to poke through. And I thought that could actually be amazing if there's a gap on the horizon for the sun to come through and light up the entire sky. And that's exactly what happened. So because I was running around earlier, I knew exactly where I had to go to find a good composition. And then the sky absolutely went crazy. And the funny thing is, so this is actually on the right-hand side, no editing involved, because the sky turned orangey or purple. Whatever was left from the lavender actually changed color to that kind of purple glow as well. And that's why I put the back of the camera shot on the right-hand side, because otherwise you probably wouldn't believe me. And that's the time lapse. And really have a look at the sky and how the color in the sky changes. Didn't last long, maybe like half an hour, but that's the final image. Again, I do have to say I probably added a little bit more saturation, but it definitely, there was a lot of purple there and a lot more than I actually expected. And again, in terms of composition, strong leading lines, you probably see that there's 1/3 sky, 2/3 foreground, and then also having that kind of top view on the lavender itself to kind of create that depth of field as well, kind of the composition I went to. And there was actually one other photographer in the field as well. And those who know me or in person, I'm normally a very shy person. I don't talk to other photographers. I always feel like everyone else takes better pictures than me. But that night, actually, that other guy was quite an outgoing guy. He came up to me and said, hey, that was a beautiful sunset. And what did you get? So we actually got talking. That was in 2018. And now we're best friends. He lives in Ballarat in Victoria, and we often go out on adventures together, did lots of other trips. So definitely would recommend talking to other photographers. You never know what happens later on, and they might become your best friend down the road. So don't be too shy to be out there. I know it's difficult, and I still get intimidated when I see other photographers, but yeah, didn't really expect to meet someone there in the field that I'm still friends with 3-4 years later. But yeah, definitely good experience. The next thing I wanted to do in Tasmania is there's a little steam train between the towns of Strachan and Queenstown. And I love steam trains, always look beautiful. I don't like to be in it, or I mean, I don't mind being in it, but I always find them a lot more interesting to photograph. And obviously it's cheaper as well. So I was looking for a perfect location. I drove around for about an hour next to the train lines to find a composition that where you don't have any sky there, not to blow out any highlights. And I'll show you actually again why I wanted this location. So this one was the first reason, as I said before, was not to have any sky in there. The next one was I wanted kind of a bit of a curve in there so I can see the train from the front, but also from the side as it comes around the corner. And then the last one was that I was looking for something where you can still see a little bit of light to kind of add a bit of interest on it. And all I had to do is then wait for the train. And because I like to create behind the scenes content, I actually put my little GoPro on the train tracks. And although it's a tiny little camera, I actually was quite nervous because I actually had no idea what would happen with that camera. And I also didn't want to freak out the train driver in case he would do like an emergency brake because he sees something on the tracks, because I didn't want to be responsible for that whole train coming to a standstill. So I tried to cover it up, put some leaves around it, put a rock around it to really hide it. And I was standing next to the track in a red jumper to really draw attention to me and not that little camera on the tracks. And then the train was coming, and that's really when it got exciting. That's the little GoPro trying to hide it between the rocks, and this is what happened. So nothing overly exciting in terms of photos, but I just like to use that little camera to create something that, again, you wouldn't really see with your naked eye. And obviously I wouldn't lay on the train tracks and let a train run over me, but definitely something interesting to see from a bit of a distant perspective. And then on the other side, the picture, that's on the back of my camera, it actually worked out as well. And so all that planning actually paid off. And as I said before, it doesn't have any sky in here, so it only has the trees from the forest in the background to not have any blown out highlights. It has the locomotive from the front and the carriages from the side, and you have a few light spots on the train itself to really make that add a bit of interest. That's the final image. These days, I would probably say it looks a bit too greenish. I'm not sure if I did something wrong with the white balance, but in terms of composition, quite happy how that all turned out. And then let's go overseas. As I said before, I'm from Germany, from Europe, and once a year before COVID, obviously, I usually went home to see my family, but then also decided to often put in like a week's worth of photography trip somewhere. So went to places in the Dolomites, and I can do a whole other presentation about Dolomites if you want me to come back. How I plan my trips there, how I travel around, how I find locations, where I stay, and a few of my quirky little funny adventures. This one is the castle in Bavaria, Munich, called Neuschwanstein. Yeah, absolutely loved it up there. And you can probably imagine, like where I actually parked my car was below the castle. So when I woke up in the morning, everything was just covered in fog. And I had no idea how that would look like, or if there was fog or if there was clouds or not. But I decided, hey, I'm here to take some photos. So I actually walked through the fog up to, I don't know how high that actually was, but behind that castle you saw, and then setting up the little GoPro. That's what the time lapse was recorded on. And then, yeah, I think sat there for 3 to 4 hours and just watched the sunrise and also the waves or the fog flowing around in front of me. That was absolutely amazing. But I also did a few silly things like this one. So I was, as I said, I was traveling alone, so I didn't have anyone else to take pictures of me. So I had to set up a self timer and a time lapse and run up and down the mountain. But I think the final image, again, was worth it. Don't worry, it wasn't actually as scary as it may look here in this picture. And I was very, very careful walking up there. Also having those tracking poles there for extra stability. But yeah, absolutely amazing experience. And in terms of composition, again, have the leading line in here. Have the difference between the complementary colors, orange jacket and green foreground. And I think that's about it in terms of composition, but absolutely love the mountains out there. And the next location was one of the places in Switzerland. This place is called Landwasserviadukt. And it's I think this specific composition here with the train coming out of the tunnel, crossing that viaduct and going in another tile underneath where I was standing is quite a popular one. They actually built a photographer platform up there. So I knew that would be an interesting location, and I just needed to wait for good light. So the only problem was that there's only one train, or there's two trains, one from each side, from each direction, but they're only once an hour. So I kind of figured out what time the trains would be arriving there. And my idea was to kind of get like a long exposure of the train either going in or out of the tunnel and kind of have that stretchy line coming out of the tunnel. So I saw the train come in from one side and all of a sudden got wet, but didn't get back to the car. Prepared my camera to make sure it's dry enough after it started raining. Let's see if I got that last shot there. So this is kind of the idea I had in mind with that red shot, but with that red train going in or out of the tunnel. But again, it wasn't really something I was overly happy with. Even the edited version wasn't really, there's still something missing. Maybe the train wasn't long enough, or I missed that first part here coming in. So I went back later at night, tried the same thing again, only once an hour, was raining. Tried that at night, again, didn't look really well, really great, because you can hardly see the train. You just see that green light and then a bit of light on the bridge. So I went back again the next morning. But then the next morning I decided, hang on, why should I shoot what everyone else is shooting? So I actually turned my camera around and found this train, which is a bit more like an S-shaped or like a question mark line here. And what I've worked out the previous days was what is actually the perfect exposure time or the shutter speed to get all of the train tracks covered with the train and have the train still look at smooth and nice and red. So this is actually then the image I got at the end of that session. And while the images on the previous day didn't really work out, I think it was the perfect practice basically, or training camp for me to get to this shot. And with this one I actually got quite lucky. This is actually one image. I didn't play around with this one. With this one I got quite lucky because the train was actually longer than the normal train. So that meant for the entire, I think it was a 6-second exposure. For the entire exposure, the train was covering the entirety of the tracks. Because if you, for example, shoot a 6-second exposure and the train only covers this bit here at the bottom for maybe like a second, you have 1 second of train and 5 seconds of no train. So you would actually see in this long exposure, you would see the train tracks come through and it wouldn't look as great anymore. So this one I got really, really lucky, was the perfect length of the train, but also the perfect exposure time. Yeah, that was actually 15. And I did have a 10-stop filter here. So I can, oh no, it was 6 seconds. So I can actually shoot for 15 seconds in the middle of the day and not blow out anything. So that really, really, really helped. Another shot, this is the Matterhorn. Anyone may have seen this kind of mountain here in the background. One of the highest hotels you can stay in Western Europe. The hotel on the right-hand side, it's called the Gornergrad. It is on 3,100 meter. Definitely had a massive headache staying there the night, but it was such a beautiful site up there and definitely worth it. So that was in 2017, and this was 2018 from the Dolomites. But again, Dolomites, if you ever want me to come back, I can do a whole other story about the Dolomites in these beautiful mountains up here. Same with this one. And you can probably see maybe a bit of a journey of where I started with my photography, with very basic things to then being confident enough to go to a bit more like bigger locations, a bit more beautiful scenes, traveling around the world, and really actually understanding how I use my camera to make the most of these kind of scenes. Before we finish up, I just wanted to take you to one specific image that I've taken, I think 5 years ago, but it really is very not typical of what I normally shoot. But it's a picture that was featured by the Head-On Photo Festival. I'm not sure if you heard about the Head-On Photo Festival. And I got lucky enough to be selected as one of the finalists for the landscape competition. I didn't win anything, but it ended up in the New South Wales Parliament House in the city. And the way it actually came apart, I'm not sure if anyone's seen that before, is I was trying to capture the vibe of the suburb Newtown in Sydney. So for me, Newtown was always this kind of vibrant alternative place. There was lots of graffiti, and I got into photographing that, and it's like, well, that's all pretty cool, but again, in the end, it's not really my art because it's someone else that painted those or sprayed these things on walls. And while it does look, I don't know, good, or some people would say it's just doesn't look that great, I wanted to kind of capture that vibe of the city in a different from that suburb in a different kind of light. So I came up with doors. So I actually don't really ask me why I came up with doors. I think it's because when I was a child in my mum's bedroom, there was a picture of a collage with a couple of doors in there. So for some reason, I decided, oh, like Newtown looks quite quirky. They have a few red doors in there, and I walked 6 hours through Newtown and Erskineville and sneakily took pictures from the pedestrian from the walkway. I didn't really walk onto anyone's property. Took picture of probably around 130 different doors, and when I came home, I was actually quite surprised how many different colors there are. And yeah, it was quite interesting then to kind of see there's actually like a few yellow ones, a few pink ones, a few modern ones, a few old school ones, and yeah, put that together and I'll show you. So what I actually did is, let's go back this way. So shooting this kind of thing was one thing, but then putting it all together was kind of a separate thing. So I wanted to look a bit like chaos, but I also wanted to put some structure in that chaos. So if you actually look a bit closer, you see there's one red door here right in the center. That's kind of the starting point. And then I have a red door on this side, 2 doors left, and a red door on the right-hand side. And then you have a bit of a circle of red doors if you go diagonally up. And then you have a circle of red doors here and a circle of red doors here, a bit like an 8 on its side, or like glasses. And when you look at all the other colors, I always try to line them up symmetrically. Like there's a yellow door above the red door in the center, and there's one below, and so on. So you have the black doors in the top right and the top left, and the bottom left and bottom right. So that's how I try to put a bit of like a bit of a system to it. So what I actually did is so ignore my handwriting, but I actually counted how many colors I had of each door. And then I started with putting this grid together, and I gave each color a number. I actually forgot, like here, this is like the number here is like the red ones have the number 1, the brown ones have number 3, blue number whatever. So this is when I came up with that grid. And I knew I had to have an uneven number of columns here to get that one center column and center row in here. That's where the little cross is in here. And because there would be no way to decide how, I think it's 119 doors in total for this collage, which door to put where. So I actually printed all these doors. I went to Officeworks, printed them all out, obviously cropped them so they all have the right frame around each door and the right size. And then I put them on my bedroom floor. so I can actually rearrange them and see, hey, how does this look? Does this red door look better over there, over there? What do I do? And then I added all the other colors one by one, started with the red one, then the yellow one, then the blue ones, and ended up then with this. And then once I had all of that done, so let's watch, is there a time lapse? Once I had that all done, let's go one back. I then went back into my computer. So I didn't take a picture of this collage because that obviously would be a bit messy. But then I knew exactly on my computer which door I had to move where in the collage. So once I opened up Photoshop and had the 119 layers in there, it was a lot easier to move things around. They're all the same size, the same pixels on each side. And then it took me about probably only 20 minutes to put each door into place, and I knew it would look good. Submitted that to the Head-On Photo Festival, and ended up in the Parliament for 4 weeks, which was pretty amazing thing to see some of my pictures up there. And because Head-On is really good in marketing their competition, they actually took that to China, to New Zealand. It ended up in the Randwick Children's Hospital to put kind of some joy out of those people that end up in hospital and just want to distract themselves. And absolutely beautiful. However, then I think that was Tiger Airways. They got wind of it and they promoted the Head-On Photo Festival the year after. And I didn't actually get a copy of the in-flight magazine until it was already printed and all done. And then when I saw it, I was absolutely shocked what they did to my picture. Because after what I told you earlier, that I had a specific system how I arranged the doors, they totally missed that and printed this image in a totally the wrong way. It's cropped, which for an image like this, like they should have not done that. This just totally ruins the whole composition. But they also put the center of the image here on the right hand side, so it kind of loses this kind of those two red rings that I put in there. And I was pretty annoyed that they did that. But in the end, still a pretty cool collage. Again, the concept of combining different things is probably not new. I think I've seen this with letterboxes or with beach umbrellas or with shoes or other things. But again, it was something where I kind of was a bit bored one afternoon, and it ended up to be something completely different to what I normally shoot, and everything else what you saw earlier today was obviously different. But really, really enjoyed this project, and was quite lucky to get this photo in a couple of competitions and then seen around the world. And that's pretty much my journey as photographer. So started with these kind of smaller cameras, and now this is a photo of my website. So now I do sell prints and calendars and sell photoshops and run workshops and give these presentations. So never would have expected to end up here when I started and bought my first DSLR, or when I first had that analog film camera years ago, that I would ever do these kind of things and actually talk in front of people or educate or teach what I've learned, so that other people can go out there and create something similar. But quite happy where I ended up, and I've met so many people throughout that journey and had so much joy, and actually learned that once I connect with other people rather than shooting with myself, my photography, I guess the quality has lifted up. I learned from a lot more things from other people. People share ideas. For example, hey, tonight the opera house is lit up with a beautiful collage. Maybe you should go out there. So definitely recommend, and obviously you guys are on that club, which is a lovely thing. Reach out to other people and help each other out, which actually helped me then over the last couple of years. And this is probably something I want to finish with, because this is kind of the photography I do these days, which is a 360-degree camera. It's a tiny little thing that looks like the GoPro, but that has two lenses, one facing each side with a 180-degree angle view, and both combined together. Shooting a time lapse over 6 hours gets you pictures like that, which again probably gives you a headache because it looks all a bit all over the place. But this is basically where my photography has taken me, moving away from like looking at different cameras or like getting the fanciest camera, rather to like looking at interesting composition than trying to shoot something that's a little different. And anyone who's paid attention, like that whiter, brighter light at the bottom here is actually the moon rising towards the end of that exposure. That's pretty much all from my side. I probably did talk very fast and I covered a lot of different topics. if there's anything you would like me to come back for and talk about in more detail, or if anyone is interested to get into private workshops, more than happy to take you through that. Yeah, just give me, send me a message either on my website or on Instagram or wherever, and I'm happy to help out. And I'll just put that up here if anyone is interested in joining me in the Shangri-La for a couple of hours later in August. Feel free to scan this or go on my website. And I guess now we open it up for questions.
I think we're all stunned. Thank you, Jan. That was absolutely fantastic.
I do have to say that for the last 3.5 years, I was single. So I didn't have a partner. My family lives in Germany. I don't have any kids. So obviously spending nights out there in the cold. Yeah, doing a lot of sunrises and sunsets is not very, in terms of like family, not a very social event. And I don't think I will keep them up for the rest of my life. But I definitely enjoy that. And yeah, it's really brightens up my days when I go out and shoot a nice sunrise and forget about everything else that's going around in the world. But I do understand it's not always possible for everyone else to dedicate that time to like stand out there in the dark and the cold to shoot a 2-hour time lapse with the Milky Way.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was absolutely great. I think, as I said, we're quite a few of us are nowhere near there. It took a few years to learn all of that.
Different styles as well, and it does take a bit of time to get into like certain techniques. I originally wasn't too much into editing, but what some people say, if you edit too much, it's a bit of a, I don't know, you fake it. But I really felt like learning the editing part, learning to become comfortable in Photoshop, then really helped me to kind of visualize the image or the vision I had in mind, rather than just maybe how it really actually looked like in reality. But it really helped me to create, I guess, something beautiful. If it looked exactly like that in real life, I probably don't really care too much about it. But most of the stuff, or pretty much all of the stuff I do, I don't really fake things in a way that I add additional elements that were never there. For example, landscape photography, a lot of people or sometimes add like a flock of birds in the sky. I don't really obviously would do these things, but I would do things like the time blend you saw earlier, those kind of stuff. But I guess that's everyone's personal preference, how much editing they want to do. So like I would not put my DSLR camera on the train tracks. That obviously would be quite risky, and they're obviously way more expensive. But they are quite little like sturdy. They're mainly used for action cameras, like people that go like surfing, skiing, doing lots of like mountain biking. They clip them to their helmets or have them somewhere standing. So they're quite sturdy, and yeah, they last through a lot of like different scenarios. And but what I mainly use them for are these kind of time-lapse videos that you saw, because they're very easy to set up. You have the video immediately as a video file, the time lapse, and you can just play it without too much editing later on. If I take the pictures of the night sky with my camera, I actually have to take individual pictures and then later put that into a video together. That's a lot of, that actually takes a long time. I mean, nowadays, some cameras can actually do that in the camera as well. But yeah, it's nice to have kind of a smaller camera for those kind of behind the scenes contents on handy. And they bring out new GoPros almost every year that probably costs around $500 or something like that. But yeah, I found them quite useful to have that kind of either the 360 camera for those kind of weird 360 views, or the GoPro as kind of behind the scenes content. You can take individual photos as well, but keep in mind the GoPros are probably, I don't know, like smaller than my hand. So the image sensor are not that great. So it depends on what you want to do with those photos. It's probably similar to maybe a phone photos. I mean, yes, phones take great photos these days as well. And you have most people have their phones with you all the time. So that's always easier than carrying a bigger camera. So yes, they work as photos as well. And they're actually quite good these days. Obviously, every time they bring out a new model, they improve the software. But keep in mind, it is a bit of a smaller sensor. So they might struggle in certain scenarios, for example, when it's very contrasty, or when you have a nice, beautiful orange sky, but the foreground is quite dark. I probably wouldn't shoot those kind of pictures with a GoPro, but like anything daytime, GoPros are definitely fine for that. Yeah, actually, I've heard that a lot. So yes, crop camera. I bought the crop sensor camera back then because I didn't want to spend too much money on the full frame camera without actually knowing what I'm doing. And I didn't really know too much about professional lenses, so I just went for the kit lens. And hopefully what you've seen throughout this presentation is that I'm not sure if you would have even recognized that this is like a kind of a more entry-level camera with like the composition, the light, and the location, and maybe the editing itself is much more important than having like a $10,000 camera. For certain situations, for example, like Astro, a newer camera would probably produce a cleaner image if you want to print it and enlarge it or something like that. Otherwise, if you know your way around, like in terms of the editing to really bring out the details, I don't think it makes too much of a difference. That said, I will probably upgrade to a full frame camera very, very soon, because I think after 8 years, for me, it's time for something new. And most people will probably, I would say, not see the difference, but it should make the editing part easier. And also when I want print pictures, they should look a little bit cleaner. Definitely don't need to go for the most expensive gear. They like, even like the GoPro, your phones are usually fine. And if you know a little bit about composition and the light and the right location, you can still create amazing images.
Thank you, Jan. That sounds like there's no more questions coming. No. Thank you very much.
Just letting everybody know that this was hosted by East's Photo Club. A big welcome to the non-members who attended tonight, and please sort of consider sort of coming along to our club. And I've shared the details of East Photography Club on the screen, so you can see the website and the email address for if you want some more information.
Can I just say, all the visitors, they're all welcome to come to our Snap and Chat, and also on our excursions in the city. That'd be lovely. Anybody who would like to join, we'd be very, very happy to see you there. I think that's probably the end of our session. So thank you very much, Jan, and all the visitors for joining us. Thank you.
Have a good night then. Bye-bye.